When was the last time you've been to the Carnegie Museum of Natural History? Has anybody never been to the Carnegie Museum of Natural History? I see a couple hands. I can't recommend it enough. It's a fascinating place. Honestly, it's a treasure trove. I grew up here in Pittsburgh. I remember going to the museum as a child. When Charlotte was younger, we took her once, and I think maybe Simon was a baby at the time when we went. However, just this past week, Simon requested to go see the dinosaurs as part of his birthday present. So that's what we did. We went to go see the dinosaurs. And I have to tell you, I'm not sure who was more excited, him or me. I very much so have taken our local museum for granted. Did you know that the Carnegie Museum has long been considered the closest and solo rival to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City? It's considered its arch rival, especially during the heyday of museums like 100 years ago. In fact, this is where I get a little nerdy because this is about history and involves Pittsburgh and all that stuff, so I get a little nerdy about it. But when Andrew Carnegie commissioned the hunt for a large dinosaur for a museum in Pittsburgh in the 1890s, it was that commissioning that largely triggered effectively a gold rush in places like Wyoming and Montana and Utah. This is what led to the discovery and the prominent display of Dippy, the Diplodocus. Dippy is they call it a type specimen. I didn't even know what that meant, but I learned while I was there. It is the specimen that all other Diplodocus specimens are compared to before they're put on display elsewhere. The same thing is true for our T-Rex. Do you know about our T-Rex? Our T-Rex is so cool. We have the original Tyrannosaurus Rex pulled out of the ground. When modern man discovered that there was this dinosaur called the Tyrannosaurus Rex, it was that fossil that defined the species. Now, originally, it was housed in New York at the American Natural History Museum. However, Barnum Brown, who was the head paleontologist there, sold it to Pittsburgh in 1941 because he was afraid that the New York City was going to be bombed during the Second World War. So they sold it to Pittsburgh, and it has stayed ever since. It is the original T-Rex. How cool is that? Like that's fascinating to me. The other part that is so cool, I'm going to keep going. The vast majority of museums around the world only put casts on display. They put plaster casts on display in their museums. We take for granted the fact that we have, at least with these two and a few other specimens, the actual fossilized bones on display. And it's one of the only places in the world that has this. I mean, it makes sense because there's only so many fossils out there to put up. So you have to copy them so you can, put them up around the world. However, it's also because these fossils, especially these extremely rare, nearly complete specimens, they're practically priceless. I mean, because it's not often that you pull up an entire animal, fossilized animal out of the ground. You get a bone here or a fragment there, but an entire specimen, it's considered priceless when it's put up on display. So it's oftentimes just the plaster cast, and the fossil is actually preserved somewhere else. But in Pittsburgh, we have actual fossilized bones on display. I'm telling you, if you haven't gone to the museum in a while, or if you haven't appreciated the museum that we have, I highly recommend it. And Thursday nights are the best, by the way, because if you go after 3 o'clock, it's half price, and they're open till 8, and there's nobody there. It was crazy. It was like the 4 of us in the entire museum. We were chased by the same security guard like 3 times because Erin kept putting her backpack on her back. They were like, "Don't wear your..." Yeah, anyway, it's a long story. I don't have time to get into it, but it was just super cool. If you get a chance, go make some time to go see it because it's just very special. This museum we have is very special. The only thing that would be better than viewing these massive specimens of ancient dry bones would be if they took on flesh again. Now, I know that sounds like the basis for a novel or a blockbuster movie that didn't end well. I get that. I hear that. But it's the best segue I could come up with to transition to our latest installment of our Stranger Things message series. We are days away from the occasion in which most of our neighbors, most of our friends and family will be celebrating all things spooky, all things creepy and terrifying, ghosts and monsters, UFOs and mummies, skeletons and witches. All these things we see prominently displayed in yards and on homes during this time of the year. Most churches tend to ignore these things, and some of them actively refuse to talk about it, despite the fact that most of these things and so many other mysteries and creepy stories can be found deep in the recesses of our Bibles. Now, we started this series a couple weeks ago by considering the story of the fallen angels and their offspring. You remember those creatures, these giants known as the Nephilim? Last week, we continued this series by considering the book or story from the book of Daniel about this spectral hand which appeared and wrote on the wall of King Belshazzar's palace in Babylon after he defiled some ancient Jewish relics. Today, we have another eerie story. This one stemming from a contemporary of Daniel's. It's a story of a valley full of scattered dry bones. Doing that very thing I talked about would be cool if those dinosaurs did. These dry bones coming back together, taking on flesh, and returning to life. It's a fantastically mysterious setting. But the story couldn't be more clear with its message. Its message is clear and decisive. It's about God's desire to breathe new life into our world and our role in that mission. Before we read the passage, I want to give you a little heads up. The story we're reading here this morning is a different kind of story than the two we've previously considered in the series. The previous two stories were historical narratives, meaning they were stories about actual events that actually took place in the history of Israel. The story we're looking at today is a prophetic message. It's a prophetic vision. Now, it did happen. It was something that Ezekiel did experience, but it's a vision that God gave to him specifically to give a message to the people of Israel. Ezekiel's prophetic ministry occurred roughly around the same time frame and in the same area as Daniel, whom we read about last week. Ezekiel and Daniel would have been contemporaries. They both lived during the Babylonian exile. These were 70 of the hardest years in the history of Israel. They were cut off from the land of Israel. God's holy temple had been completely destroyed. And as we read last week, the Babylonians were utterly merciless in many ways. We know about the way they treated their artifacts and the way they treated some of the Israelites as they were held captive in their land. To the Jews now forced to live in Babylon, the future seemed bleak. It was like this black hole into which the people were destined to disappear. The exile was more than just a crisis of physical suffering. It was a crisis of faith for the Israelites. The key symbols of the Jewish faith, the symbols like Jerusalem, its temple, its people, and the Davidic monarchy in and of itself had been utterly destroyed. As far as many of the Jewish people were concerned at that time, their God had been defeated by what they could only assume was a stronger Babylonian God. So for many of the Jewish people, for many of the Israelites in exile, all hope was lost. It's from within this context, this very dire context, that the prophet Ezekiel speaks the words that God gave him to speak to his fellow Jews living in the land of Babylon. So let's go ahead and dive into the text. We're looking at Ezekiel chapter 37. It's 14 verses 1 through 14. This is what the prophet had to say, and it's in your handout. The Lord took hold of me, and I was carried away by the Spirit of the Lord to a valley filled with bones. He led me all around among the bones that covered the valley floor. They were scattered everywhere across the ground and were completely dried out. Then he asked me, Son of man, can these bones become living people again? O sovereign Lord, I replied, you alone know the answer to that. Then he said to me, speak a prophetic message to these bones and say, dry bones, listen to the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Look, I'm going to put breath into you and make you live again. I will put flesh and muscles on you and cover you with skin. I will put breath into you and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord. So I spoke this message just as he told me. Suddenly, as I spoke, there was a rattling noise across the valley. The bones of each body came together and attached themselves as complete skeletons. Then as I watched, muscles and flesh formed over the bones. The skin formed to cover their bodies. But they still had no breath in them. Then he said to me, speak a prophetic message to the winds, son of man. Speak a prophetic message and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Come, O breath, from the four winds. Breathe into these dead bodies so that they may live again. So I spoke the message as he commanded me, and breath came into their bodies. They all came to life and stood up on their feet, a great army. Then he said to me, Son of man, these bones represent the people of Israel. They are saying, we have become old, dry bones. All hope is gone. Our nation is finished. Therefore, prophesy to them and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says, O my people, I will open your graves of exile and cause you to rise again. Then I will bring you back to the land of Israel. When this happens, O my people, you will know that I am the Lord. I will put my spirit in you, and you will live again and return home to your own land. Then you will know that I, the Lord, have spoken, and I have done what I said. Yes, the Lord has spoken. That is one heck of a story, right? And before we dive into the story and tear it apart, I want to tell you another story, a personal story this time. As you know, most of you know, during the week I spend most of my time caring for and ministering to the families of people who are dying. I'm a hospice chaplain. And not long ago, I was working with a family that was pretty rough, a family that I will never likely forget. I instantly knew this was going to be a rough case when I read the patient's file. The patient was a Vietnam War veteran who, since the war, struggled with all sorts of addictions, alcohol, drug, you name it. He was addicted to it. The file also went into detail describing him as a married man, but he hadn't seen his wife for at least 2 decades. They were still legally married, though, but hadn't seen them. The man's children wanted little to do with him. They actively kept his children away from him because he was constantly drunk and constantly belligerent, causing endless turmoil in the family. His siblings had their own health and emotional issues going on as well. I went to visit the patient, expecting to find him in his bed, alone, completely estranged from anyone he ever knew or loved. When I arrived, I was shocked to come upon a room full of people. The patient wasn't expected to live more than a few days, perhaps even just a few hours. And his family had put their past behind them and chose instead to focus their energy on whatever ounce of love and support they could muster for this dying man. You could tell right away they had all lived very tough lives. I tried to be as encouraging as I could by thanking them for putting aside their storied pasts and whatever animosity they might have to spend these final moments with this man who had literally drank his life away. Near the end of my visit, I asked the family if they would welcome me saying a prayer for them. Just before the man's son interjected. And he interjected with words that literally broke my heart and words that I will never forget. He looked at me with tears in his eyes and said, honestly, Pastor, I appreciate the thought, but I fear they'd be wasted words. I'm pretty sure God's done with this family. It didn't take a theological or pastoral genius to figure out what exactly this family needed. This family didn't need a sermon. They didn't need a deep exegetical Bible study. What this family needed was the Spirit of God to miraculously invade their lives and make them new. So that's what I prayed for that day. That's what this passage is all about. This passage is about a nation full of people who truly believed God was done with them. They were worn out. They were dried up. These were God's holy and sacred people, but there were also people who, for a variety of reasons and in a variety of ways, had turned away from God. They rebelled against God, so God allowed the Babylonians to destroy them. The life they knew, the life they enjoyed, had been sucked out of them when their home and God's temple had been destroyed by the Babylonians. Now they were forced to live thousands of miles away in a foreign land, separated from everything they once knew and loved. God, as far as they were concerned, was done with them until Ezekiel started suggesting otherwise. One of the reasons I love Ezekiel 37 is not only because it's a story about the bones of skeletons rattling and reconnecting and rising from the dead, which is pretty cool, but because it's a picture of a consistent pattern that God follows to bring new life to people who believe that he is done with them. He does it over and over and over again. And I want to spend a couple minutes just pulling the text apart, separating it into sections so you can see exactly the same pattern that God takes over and over and over again, reminding us that he is not finished with us yet. Let's start by considering the first few verses again. It's in your handout. It's the same text as the beginning, but it's in your handout, kind of broken apart. The first 3 verses, Ezekiel says, "The Lord took hold of me. I was carried away by the Spirit of the Lord to a valley filled with dry bones. He led me all around the bones that covered the valley floor. They were scattered everywhere across the ground, and they were completely dried out. Then he asked me, Son of man, can these bones become living people again? O sovereign Lord, I replied, you alone know the answer to that. I love this moment because God is getting ready to literally change an entire nation. He's getting ready to pour out his Spirit and give them a new heart to do something miraculous. But before he uses Ezekiel to do that, God sends Ezekiel on a visionary journey to show him just how bad things truly are. God is desperate for Ezekiel's heart to break over the things that break his heart. That's why I love this moment. Because God literally tells Ezekiel, I want you to walk among the dry bones. I want you to feel their dryness. I want you to feel their pain. I want you to know just how hopeless these people actually are. Because God knows that until Ezekiel can grasp the dryness of the bones and the hopelessness of the situation, he will never be able to truly experience the new life and healing he's about to unleash. So the first stage of God's redemptive plan is always the same. We have to acknowledge the hopelessness of our current reality. We have to acknowledge the hopelessness of our current reality. Before we can ever begin to experience the new life God has in store for us, we have to fully acknowledge and appreciate just how broken, just how lost, and just how hopeless we all are without him. Just this past week, I preached at the annual memorial service that my hospice company held, and we remembered and memorialized hundreds of patients. And many of their friends and family were present. It was a packed room, standing room only. It was amazing to see. And the text I used in my message stemmed from John chapter 11. It's a famous story. You know the story. It's the story of Jesus at the grave of Lazarus, at the tomb of Lazarus. And do you remember how Jesus reacted to his friend's death? Despite knowing, even telling his disciples, he promised his disciples that Lazarus would rise again and that God would be glorified as a result of all that's going to happen here. Jesus still responded to the pain and the grief he saw around him by embracing it. He took it in upon himself. And John literally wrote, it's the shortest verse in all of the Bible, you know it, in John 11:35, Jesus wept. But even more so than weeping, John tells us Jesus was angry and he was deeply troubled. These are all emotions we endure when we grieve, when we confront the death of a loved one. God didn't change the world by sending Jesus in order to just generically preach a new moral code to us. God changed the world by literally taking on flesh, by literally and fully integrating himself into our lives, into our pain, into our suffering, into our struggles, into our loss, and sharing that experience with us. And ultimately having mercy on us because he knew exactly what we were going through. That's the message I see. That's the image I see when we read these first few verses of Ezekiel. God is inviting Ezekiel to see and to feel just how hopeless the situation is for the Jews. He wants him to walk through the valley of the shadow of death, literally. If we want to experience new life, if we want to help others experience new life, this is precisely where we have to start. We have to be real about our current circumstances. Let's continue reading and picking up in verse 4. Then he said to me, speak a prophetic message to these bones and say, dry bones, listen to the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. Look, I'm going to put breath into you and make you alive again. I'll put flesh and muscles on you and cover you with skin. I will put breath into you and you will come to life. Then you will know that I am the Lord. So I spoke this message just as he told me. I want to make sure you appreciate the gravity of the situation we're reading about here. When we were at the museum the other day, there was never a moment in which the idea crossed my mind that maybe these dinosaur bones could come back to life. And the thought never crossed my mind. My daughter, who's strangely terrified of bones, likely thought otherwise, but the reality is, I don't care how great you are at CPR, I don't care how great you are at resuscitation, I don't care how awesome you might be as a medical professional. If you try to revive dried, dead bones, people are going to think you're crazy. And they should, because dry bones don't come back to life. That's precisely what God has invited Ezekiel to do. And it has to be exactly what went through Ezekiel's mind. He's looking at this valley of bones. He says, God, what are you asking me to do? Why am I speaking to these dead bones? Don't I have a church somewhere I can go speak? Come on. So not living people I should speak to? What's the point? It's absurd. But his heart was so broken for the pain and the hopelessness of his fellow Jews that Ezekiel was willing to do anything. He was willing to do anything, even that which seemed absurd at the time, to help them. Therefore, he spoke life to dead bones. I think this is a perfect example of the second stage of God's redemptive plan, the same plan he follows throughout the Bible. Our hopelessness leads us to trust God and doing the absurd. Our hopelessness leads us to trust God and doing the absurd. In the eyes of the world, it doesn't make any sense that someone would give up their career, sell their home, and move halfway around the world to love and serve the lost, the hungry, and the hopeless souls of our world. Yet I can tell you story after story of people who have done that and are doing it just like that right now. It's absurd in the eyes of the world. How do you climb the corporate ladder if you just sell everything and you fly off to India or Africa or Asia or wherever else? In Matthew chapter 10, when Jesus commanded his disciples to go off on their own, speaking the gospel, healing the sick, casting out demons, raising the dead, Jesus warned them. In Matthew 10:16, he says, I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves. You know what that means? It means he's sending these disciples out to do the absurd. He didn't make any sense. Why are you sending us into danger? But we know the story. They did it. They did it because they trusted Jesus. They'd seen what Jesus was doing. They'd seen the way he had brought new life into broken and hurting people, and they desperately wanted to be a part of it. They acknowledged their current reality and realizing that without Christ they were hopeless, and without Christ the world was hopeless, so they willingly did what the world considered absurd. Now, of course, you don't need to move halfway around the world to show that you trust God. You don't have to physically raise people from the grave to do something quote-unquote absurd. You simply need to show your trust when God asks you to do something for him. You do the absurd every time you allow your heart to be broken for the lost, for the hungry, and the hurting, for the people living right next door to you. Anytime you befriend the people society tells you to avoid, or care for people society tells you are getting what they deserve, you're placing your trust in God above the ways of the world. When you touch the untouchable, or have mercy for the merciless, or forgive those who have wronged you over and over and over again, you are doing the absurd because you know the heart and the ways of God are better than anything that this world can offer. So we start by acknowledging our hopelessness. Then we trust God and we go and do what the world considers absurd. Let's read and pick up again the second half of verse 7, and we'll end here. Suddenly as I spoke, there was a rattling noise all across the valley. The bones of each body came together and attached themselves as complete skeletons. Then as I watched, muscles and flesh formed over the bones, then skin formed to cover their bodies. But they still had no breath in them. Then he said to me, speak a prophetic message to the winds, Son of Man. Speak a prophetic message and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Come, O breath, from the four winds. Breathe into these dead bodies so they may live again. So I spoke the message as he commanded me, and breath came into their bodies. They all came to life and stood up on their feet, a great army. This is the best part. After we've acknowledged the hopelessness of our current reality, after we trust him and are willing to do what the world considers absurd, God invites us into the fun of raising the dead to life. God invites us into the fun of raising the dead to life. You know, ever since the dawn of creation, God has never been satisfied with hogging all the joy of building his kingdom for himself. Way back in the beginning of Genesis, after God created the heavens and the earth and everything that's a part of it, God literally looked upon humanity and he spoke to Adam and Eve and he said, be fruitful and multiply. In other words, God said, this isn't about me building and creating a perfect kingdom. This is about you joining me in the effort. And now that I'm a father, I get it. I get an ounce, at least a piece of why God does what he does. I love watching my children experience all the joys and the wonders of life. I find more satisfaction than I ever thought possible watching my kids experience things that I've taken for granted while they're experiencing it for the first time. Going to the museum and seeing dinosaur bones firsthand for the first time, I could do that 1,000 times with my kids, over and over again. That's exactly what God is doing with Ezekiel, and is eager to do it with us. God could speak life into these dry bones on his own. He doesn't need Ezekiel to do this. He doesn't need him, but he wants him. He wants Ezekiel to participate in the process. God doesn't need us to love on our hurting and hopeless neighbors. God could fix their problems with a snap of his divine fingers. We know this. God wants us to be part of the process of helping them experience new life. This is precisely why Jesus established the church. It's why he called us to be his disciples. God doesn't need the church. He wants the church. He wants us to join him in his mission of bringing new life into this world. So we need to acknowledge our hopelessness without God. We need to learn to trust him and do whatever he instructs us to do, no matter how absurd. And by doing that, we will find ourselves raising the dead to life as we introduce God to those who desperately need him. Earlier, I mentioned a family for whom I prayed would experience the breath of life from God amidst a desperate and terrible situation. My heart broke for this family. They were so convinced that God was done with them, they didn't even think a prayer would help them in any way. Despite their objections, I still felt compelled to pray for them. And I offered a prayer. Then I started to take my leave, giving them space so that they could be together as a family. Not a few seconds later, after I left the family in the room with their dying loved one, the man's son ran after me, and he found me with tears in his eyes. He said, after I said amen, it was like his dad found peace. He stopped struggling. His breathing settled. His heart rate calmed. And then it just stopped. He found peace. And I will never forget the words he said to me before we parted ways. He said, maybe God isn't quite done with our family quite yet. Thanks, Pastor. Acknowledge the hopelessness of your current reality without God. Then trust him. Do whatever he commands. No matter how absurd it feels, no matter how absurd it looks to the world, do it. And I promise you, you'll witness the dead come to life. Let's close with a word of prayer.